This week's mini lecture is on network theory. While network theory is not strictly a part of organizational behavior, it does address social structures and social concepts within organizations and does have an impact on organizational behavior topics that we cover in this class. One of the keys to network theory is to understand that organizations operate as systems. There are three views of organizations as systems. The first is that an organization is an open system, that its purpose is to acquire, process, and redistribute resources, to control, adapt to external constraints. Those are key tasks for an open system organization. In an open system organization, power accrues to those who span boundaries and control critical contingencies. This is also known as a dependence framework. The second viewpoint on organizations as systems is the rational systems viewpoint. In this viewpoint, organizations are considered technical instruments designed to serve a specific purpose. The emphasis then is on creating rationality, stability, efficiency, reliability, and predictability within the organization. From a rational systems perspective, power comes to those who occupy key positions in the organizational machine. This is also known as formal structural advantages. The third perspective on organizations as systems is that an organization is a natural system, that it is a living social entity having a life of its own that is distinct from its external environment or the technical work that goes on within it, that the organization has history, purpose, character, values, and culture. In this sense, power results from natural system qualities, interest group affiliations, positions in communication networks, interpersonal obligations, and an understanding of and fit with the culture. This is also known as an informal structural advantages and social exchange framework perspective. This natural systems perspective is the platform, for the most part, the platform that the rest of this information will be based off of, an assumption that an organization is a natural system. Jeffrey Pfeffer has done a lot of work on communication networks, and here are some tidbits that are appropriate to understand. Formal structure is about how work is supposed to get done, whereas informal structure is about how it actually gets done. In this sense, knowledge produces power. Technical knowledge about work processes, but also social knowledge about a firm's social system. Access to knowledge depends on one's position in networks of communication and social relations. The big concept to understand here in terms of position in networks and social relations is the concept of centrality. The concept of centrality has three different components to it. The first is betweenness. Betweenness refers to whether or not an individual in a social system is bridging a gap between other individuals in that same social system. It's an indicator of information control. Connectedness simply means that an individual within the social system engages in a lot of activity, a lot of social activity within the communication network. And so this is an indicator of communication activity. Closeness is pretty straightforward. It's an indicator of independence. So the closer an individual is to other individuals within the social network, they're more likely to be dependent on others. And I'll come back to these three concepts in just a moment. Pfeffer looks at three different types of networks when considering network theory and the social structure of an organization. The first is the task or workflow network, and this is again pretty straightforward. It's which tasks does an individual perform, and then what other people within the organization does that person have to connect to in order to engage in the tasks or the workflow that they are responsible for. The second type of a network is an advice network or career network, and this may have absolutely nothing to do with the task network that an individual has, but it might have a little bit to do with the task network that an individual has. In terms of an advice or career network, think about mentors, opportunity, people that will give somebody an opportunity to show their talents or something like that. The last type of network that Pfeffer talks about is a trust network or a friendship network. And again, this is a pretty straightforward concept. But these three different types of networks are all operating at the same time within the same organization. And so individuals will be a part of a task network, a part of an advice network, and a part of a trust network. In that case, centrality being one of the goals, so if you have centrality within a network, any type of network, then you're going to hold a position of power. And this is kind of part of what Pfeffer is saying. And so the idea is to acquire centrality in as many of the types of networks as possible: task, advice, and trust. Some ways to acquire centrality are physical location. You can imagine that will give you the opportunity for connectedness. So if you're physically located with a lot of other people in your task or workflow network, then you will have a greater ability to acquire centrality with people that are in that network. Another way to acquire centrality is through task interdependence. This connects back to connectedness. So the more interdependent tasks are, the more connectedness an individual will have, because there will be more activity. Closeness will also be increased when tasks are interdependent with each other. And so these are just two suggestions, two different kind of avenues to create those three different components of centrality: betweenness, connectedness, and closeness. So some guidelines for developing effective networks. Analyze your current developmental needs and goals and be honest with yourself. Assess the gaps in your current network. What groups are over or underrepresented? Are you overly reliant on, for example, one person or one individual, or one person or a group of people? Are there groups of people or individuals that are missing from your network? What relationships do you need to strengthen? And what network circles do you need to add? So these are questions that you would want to ask yourself with regard to the developmental goals and needs that you've established. So you establish those goals and needs first, and then go through the set of questions to help kind of formulate a plan. Once you formulate a strategy, that'll help you to develop new contacts according to the needs that you have. Here are some strategies for building networks. Be proactive. Understand that all encounters are opportunities to develop networks. Take a broad view of from whom you can learn and benefit. You may be surprised at a person that you might run across. So remember, you've got a task network, you have an advice network, and you have a trust network. And so having all three of those networks, understanding that, hopefully will allow you to see that you need to have a broad view of from whom you can learn and benefit, because those three networks are always happening at the same time, and you never know who might be a part of one of those three networks. Get to know other people. This will enhance your centrality in general. Get to know powerful people, and get to know people of different types, people like you and people unlike you. You'll need to focus on the value that you add to the network. So you need to think of this in terms of the relationship between yourself and the network. Even though you're developing relationships with individuals, you need to also consider in building a network and being effective at leveraging a network, you need to consider yourself as what you bring to the network. So you need to have something to trade. You need to give back to the network itself and not to an individual, and also understand that reciprocity may not be immediate. So this is a long-term process to develop strong networks. Here's some more strategies for building networks. Again, take a long-term view. Begin building relationships before you really need them. Think about two outcomes: success in achieving immediate objectives, but also improving relationships so that the next exchange that you have is more productive. You want to develop networks with structural holes. A structural hole is a gap between two individuals in a network that should be filled, or could be filled ideally, by you. So and by filling that structural hole or that gap between two other individuals that might help better serve the network. By filling that gap, you're increasing your centrality in terms of betweenness, in terms of connectedness, and in terms of closeness. You want to build a somewhat disconnected network of relations. So kind of going back to the earlier point, you don't want to be over-reliant on one group of people. And you don't also want to be over-dependent on one person or one contact. And again, be realistic. Trust and credibility aren't established overnight. And this, the word trust is in this sentence, but it is true for task networks, it's true for advice networks, and it's true for trust and friendship networks. So understand that it's a process, and it takes quite a bit of time to establish a strong network. That's all I have for you today on network theory.